Welcome. You're listening to Detective Duo, bringing you tales from the golden age of mystery, adventures in the spirit of Tommy and Tuppence Beresford. Tap subscribe to stay with us and share where in the world you're listening from. The wind came in long, uneven sighs across the moor, flattening the hedgerows and sending a restless tapping against the windows of the laurels. Inside, all was comfort, a fire burning cheerfully in the grate, the curtains drawn against the storm, and a tea tray between Tommy and Tuppence Beresford that steamed like a small, civilized miracle. "Well," said Tuppence, handing him another slice of seed cake, "if the government can't keep its ministers from falling asleep in committee, I see no reason why we should feel guilty about doing the same by the fire." Tommy smiled, his eyes half closed in appreciation of the warmth. "I'm not asleep. I'm conserving energy. You never know when adventure will strike again." "Adventure, my dear man, has had the decency to leave us alone for at least 6 months. I think it's beginning to take the hint." At that precise moment, the brass knocker on the front door thundered 3 times. Both of them froze. Outside, the wind howled as though delighted to prove her wrong. "You've done it now," murmured Tommy. Tuppence set down her teacup, listening. The housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, had retired early. There was no one else to answer. "At this hour? It must be past 10. Tommy rose reluctantly. If it's a tax collector, he's chosen a terrible night for it. The knocking came again, urgent, desperate, and followed by the unmistakable rattle of the bell. When Tommy opened the door, a gust of wet wind and leaves swept into the hall. On the threshold stood a tall man in a drenched overcoat, his hair plastered to his forehead. He carried a small suitcase and looked half frozen, half terrified. I'm terribly sorry," he stammered, blinking rain from his lashes. "My car, it slid into the ditch up the road. The weather. I can't. I wondered if I might—" "Come in before you drown," said Tuppence briskly, appearing at Tommy's shoulder with a towel. The man stepped inside, his shoes squelching on the mat. The hall light glowed warmly over his angular face, good-looking in a nervous sort of way. Thank you, he murmured. "I'm Neville Crane. I was on my way to Market Blythe. Foolish of me to take this route in such weather. No inns open for miles, I'm afraid." "You're welcome to our spare room," said Tuppence before Tommy could object. "Mrs. Finch will be scandalized, of course, but she need never know." Crane smiled faintly, relieved. "You're very kind. I assure you, I'll leave first thing in the morning." "Nonsense. You'll catch pneumonia if you do. Come and warm yourself." In the drawing room, the fire hissed at the sudden addition of wet air. Crane knelt briefly by the flames, holding out his hands. Tuppence noticed how steady they were, too steady for someone claiming exhaustion. "Allow me," Tommy said, taking his dripping coat. It was heavy, a good London make, and smelled faintly of sea salt. He hung it on the rack, his eyes resting on the small leather suitcase Crane had set beside the hearth. The initials stamped on the lid read EM, not NC. "Long drive from London?" Tommy asked lightly. Yes, from London," Crane replied too quickly. "I was visiting a friend in Hampstead." "And your car's in a ditch, you said?" Crane nodded. "Quite hopeless, I'm afraid." Tuppence poured him a measure of brandy. "Then it's settled. You'll stay the night. The roads will be fit for travel in the morning." He hesitated, then accepted the glass. "You're exceedingly kind, Mrs. Beresford, and this is my husband Tommy." Something flickered across Crane's face, recognition perhaps, but it vanished almost at once. "Ah, yes, I've heard the name. You were involved in the intelligence department during the war, weren't you?" Tommy's expression was mild. "We dabbled." "How curious," said Crane softly, almost to himself. For a few minutes they talked of inconsequential things, the weather, the village, the difficulty of finding petrol coupons. But beneath the politeness was an undercurrent of watchfulness. Crane's answers were polite but evasive, and his eyes seemed to drift constantly toward the window, as though expecting someone or something to appear out of the dark. When the clock on the mantel chimed 11, Tuppence rose. "I'll show you your room, Mr. Crane. You'll find hot water in the jug and an extra blanket in the chest." He followed her upstairs, moving quietly for such a tall man. Tommy waited until the footsteps faded before bending to examine the suitcase. It was locked. He frowned. A moment later, Tuppence returned, her expression thoughtful. "Well?" Tommy asked. He thanked me 3 times and smiled only once, That's not the ratio of a man telling the whole truth. Tommy grinned. You're beginning to sound like Inspector Craddock. And you're beginning to sound like a man who's about to do something idiotic, like picking that lock. Wouldn't dream of it. Though I did notice his initials don't match his name. E.M. Perhaps he borrowed the case. Or perhaps he borrowed the name, she said quietly. Outside, thunder rumbled. The lights flickered, and for one brief instant the room plunged into darkness. When they came on again, Tommy thought he saw a shadow move across the landing above, a silent, swift shape against the dim light. Probably the wind, Tuppence said, though her voice lacked conviction. They checked the windows, drew the curtains tighter, and returned to the fire. The mood of comfort had vanished. The house seemed to listen with them, every creak of the timbers sounding like a footstep. "Tommy," she said after a long silence, "do you think he really recognized your name?" "I rather think he did. The question is, from where?" "Suppose he's a journalist?" "Then he'd have a notebook. Suppose instead he's one of our old acquaintances from the wrong side of the curtain." "In that case," Tuppence said briskly, "we'd better make sure the silver's polished and the revolver loaded." He laughed softly. "You always did have the most charming domestic instincts." At 11:30, they decided to call it a night. The storm had eased, the rain turning into a steady patter on the windows. Tuppence paused at the foot of the stairs, listening. "He's moving about," she whispered. Tommy nodded. "Let's hope it's only the search for a toothbrush." But the creak overhead was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the landing, stopping just above them, then moving again toward the guest room. A door closed quietly. Silence. "Well," said Tuppence, exhaling, "if he's a murderer, he's a very tidy one." "Tomorrow," Tommy said, "I'll stroll down to the ditch and see if there's a car in it at all. And if there isn't, then I'll know exactly how much of a fool I am." They went up at last. The lamps turned low. As Tuppence brushed her hair before the mirror, she caught sight of the guest room door across the hall, closed but not quite shut. A thin line of light showed beneath it. "He's awake," she murmured. "And so are you," said Tommy from bed. She hesitated a moment longer, then clicked off her light. "Let's see what morning brings." Outside, the storm retreated into the distance. Inside the laurels, the only sound was the clock's steady ticking, marking time, as if waiting for something to begin. Morning came shyly to the laurels, pressing its pale face against the curtains as though uncertain of its welcome. A weak November light crept across the breakfast table, silvering the teapot and the dish of eggs, while Tuppence moved about with the calm precision of a woman who knew that hospitality was both an art and a weapon. Tommy sat behind the morning paper, hair still damp from his shave, one slippered foot balanced on the fender. From the landing above came the steady creak of a floorboard, Mr. Neville Crane beginning to stir. "If our mysterious guest slept as restlessly as he looks," Tommy remarked, "he'll need a gallon of coffee to recover." "Then we shall give him tea," Tuppence replied serenely, setting out another cup. "Coffee is far too good for a man who lies about his initials." "Still thinking about that suitcase?" "Constantly," she said, with the briskness of a woman who enjoyed being suspicious. "E.M., indeed. He strikes me as a man with more than one identity, and fewer than one conscience." Before Tommy could answer, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Crane entered, freshly shaven and outwardly composed. The storm had left him pale but undeniably handsome, his dark hair still damp at the temples. "Good morning, Mrs. Beresford. Mr. Beresford. I must apologize for intruding upon you last night. I hardly slept a wink. Too much gratitude, I imagine." "Nonsense," said Tuppence, pouring tea. "It was the wind howling like an unpaid tax collector. You'll find country tempests far more opinionated than London ones." Crane smiled politely. "Quite. I'm more accustomed to the tropics, actually. One forgets how English rain insists upon conversation." "The tropics?" Tommy asked, lowering his paper. "Yes. West Africa, mostly. Export trade. Timber, rubber, the odd shipment of cocoa. I'm hoping to set up a small company of my own." "Really?" said Tuppence, her tone lightly curious. "How enterprising." "Oh, not so much. One merely needs patience and the right connections." "Connections can be such dangerous things," she murmured. Crane looked up sharply, but Tuppence was already buttering toast with a smile that could have disarmed a customs officer. The conversation turned to pleasanter banalities. the state of the roads, the previous night's storm, and the village grocer's scandalous habit of watering the milk. Crane's voice was measured, cultivated, too cautious, Tuppence thought, for a man supposedly involved in trade. He handled his teacup with care as though it were part of a performance. Then, as Tommy reached for the marmalade, Crane's hand darted casually across the table. He picked up a corner of the newspaper, folded it, and slipped it almost absently into his pocket. Tuppence's eyes flicked to the gap he left behind. The missing scrap had held a small column from the Daily Chronicle. Ministry courier missing, classified files disappear with civil servant near Paddington. Her pulse quickened, though her voice was smooth as honey. "Would you care for more toast, Mr. Crane?" "Thank you. No, I never eat heavily in the morning. Too much travel, you know. It ruins one's appetite." "Indeed," Tommy said mildly. "I find it does quite the opposite. Nothing like a night in the rain to sharpen hunger and suspicion." Crane laughed politely, but not naturally. "Suspicion, Mr. Beresford. Only of the weather. It's devilishly unreliable this time of year." A silence followed, thin, brittle. Then Crane rose, apologizing for troubling them, and went upstairs to pack his things. The moment the door closed, Tuppence leaned forward. "You saw it too?" "Naturally. Article about a courier gone missing. You suppose he meant to steal it for light reading?" "If so, he's taking quite an interest in foreign affairs." "Classified files, Tommy. That doesn't sound like cocoa exports to me." Tommy folded the paper neatly. "You think he's mixed up in it?" "I think we've harboured something more than a polite inconvenience, and if he's what I suspect, he won't be leaving as soon as he claims." From the kitchen came the sound of crockery and Gladys's cheerful humming. Mrs. Finch's young maid was as round and red-cheeked as a winter apple, loyal but incapable of silence. She appeared at the door with a dusting-cloth and a face brimming with curiosity. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but I thought I ought to mention. I heard the gentleman walking about half the night. Up and down the hall he was. Creak, creak, creak. Gave me the willies, it did." "At what hour?" asked Tuppence. "Round 3, maybe 1:30. I thought he was looking for something. I nearly came out to ask, but, well, he sounded like a man on the prowl." "Thank you, Gladys," said Tuppence sweetly. "That's most informative. You may go on dusting the hall, quietly." As the maid departed, Tommy met Tuppence's gaze. Pacing at 3 a.m., pocketing newspapers, lying about his trade. Yes, he's practically a model guest. "We'll let him hang himself a little more before we tighten the knot," she said. The telephone rang suddenly, slicing through the calm. Tommy crossed to answer it. "Beresford residence, who's speaking?" A familiar Cockney voice crackled down the line. "Albert here, sir. Blimey, am I glad I caught you. Got a bit of excitement in town. Word from a friend of mine at the ministry. They're all in a proper stew about a fella playing both sides of the fence. Some sort of double agent, they say. Last spotted heading out of London yesterday." Tommy's tone sharpened. "Name?" "Ain't sure, sir. They're keeping it tight. But the description, tall, dark hair, good speaker, goes by more than one name. Thought you might like to know, seeing as you've a habit of collecting odd visitors." "Thanks, Albert. You've a fine instinct for timing." Tommy replaced the receiver and turned to Tuppence. "That was Albert. There's a double agent on the loose. Fits Crane's description rather neatly." "So, our Mr. Crane may be the latest specimen in the intelligence zoo," said Tuppence. "In which case we'd better make sure he doesn't escape before feeding time." A sound on the stairs interrupted them, the faint thump of a suitcase being closed. "Right on cue," Tommy murmured. "He's packing." Tuppence slipped out into the hall, quiet as a cat. The guest room door was ajar. She could see Crane's silhouette reflected in the dressing-table mirror as he adjusted his tie. His suitcase lay open on the bed. She hesitated, then stepped lightly inside. "Forgive me," she said pleasantly. "I wanted to see if you'd need the car to fetch yours from the ditch. Tommy can go down after breakfast." Crane turned sharply, his expression smoothing at once. "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Beresford. There's really no need. I'll telephone a mechanic from the village once the lines are clear." "As you wish," she said, letting her gaze drift casually to the bed. The case's contents were meticulous. Shirts folded with military precision, shaving kit, a single book of French verse, and a sealed envelope marked only with the letter D. He caught her glance. "Old business correspondence," he said too quickly. "Of course," Tuppence replied, smiling. "One must never mix business with pleasure, though one often does." When she left, She was certain of two things. The envelope contained something worth hiding, and their guest was far too careful for an honest man. Downstairs again, she relayed what she'd seen. Tommy listened, hands in his pockets. "It's beginning to sound rather like the old days, isn't it?" he said, "only without the benefit of a codebook or a revolver." "You have your wits," Tuppence reminded him, "and I have my instincts. Between the two, we'll manage." Crane came down a few minutes later, hat in hand. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness. I'll be back in touch once I've sorted my car." Tuppence's smile was the picture of domestic benevolence. "Do, and if you should find you've left anything behind, we'll take great care of it." He hesitated, just long enough for Tommy to note it, then inclined his head and stepped out into the cold sunlight. The sound of his footsteps faded down the gravel path. Tuppence waited until he was out of sight. "He'll be back," she said softly. "Men who lie always are." Tommy nodded. "Then we'll be ready for him." Outside, the wind had quieted, but the air around the laurels still felt charged, like a wire carrying more than mere electricity. Somewhere between the breakfast table and the front gate, the game had begun. The morning post came later than usual, trudging up the garden path in the shape of a thin, anonymous man whose boots seemed as tired as his eyes. He handed Tommy a small bundle, 2 circulars, a bill for firewood, and 1 letter in an unfamiliar hand, addressed simply to Mr. T. Beresford, The Laurels, Sutton Lee. Tommy turned it over in his fingers, noting the quality of the paper. It was thick, cream-coloured, and faintly scented with tobacco, an odd mixture of refinement and danger. "Who's it from?" asked Tuppence, glancing up from the table where she was repotting a small fern. "No return address," Tommy said, frowning. "Postmarked London, rather official-looking." "Perhaps it's the Ministry wanting your opinion on cocoa imports," she teased. "If it is," he murmured, sliding a finger beneath the flap, "they'll be disappointed." The envelope contained only a single folded sheet. On it, in tidy block letters, was written, "The sparrow nests at the Laurels." Below that, nothing. No signature, no emblem, only a faint watermark that read Government Stationery Office. Tommy's pulse quickened. He had received messages like this before, years ago, when he and Tuppence had worked for intelligence. Sparrow had once been the code name for an internal leak, a network of agents who sold information to the highest bidder. The phrase "nests at the Laurels" could mean only one thing: the leak was under his own roof. Tuppence caught the change in his expression. "Well?" "Nothing worth upsetting you about," he said lightly, slipping the paper into his pocket. "Just a note about, fertilizer. Seems our gardener ordered the wrong type." She arched an eyebrow. "Since when does the Ministry of Agriculture use cryptic stationery?" "Since never," he admitted, smiling, but his eyes stayed wary. Before Tuppence could press further, the postman coughed delicately. "Begging your pardon, sir. Bit of weather blowing in from the west. Might be a rough night again." "Thank you," said Tommy absently, closing the door. Tuppence crossed her arms. "You're hiding something." "Possibly, but it's for your own safety." "That argument didn't work in 1918, she said crisply, "and it's not working now." Tommy sighed. "Very well. It's from London. Code phrase. Means someone, something is here. Possibly our friend from last night." "The sparrow nests at the Laurels." Tuppence repeated the word softly, her mind already turning. "So we're harbouring a bird of dubious character. Charming. I suppose we'd better keep the cat sharp." He smiled faintly. "Meaning you?" "Meaning us. Though I'll admit, I scratch better." That afternoon, the house resumed its deceptive calm. The rain had eased, the garden gleamed from the washing, and the village beyond shimmered faintly in the pale sun. Mr. Crane had returned from a supposed errand to the post office, but Tuppence noticed he came back by the long way, through the orchard path that led toward the airfield. He joined them for tea, polite as ever, his charm perfectly ironed and pressed. "Delightful spot, your village," he said. "Very quiet. Almost too quiet, one might say." "That's why we like it," Tuppence replied. "Of course. I'm afraid I've grown restless in London. Always preferred the country, the open skies, the sound of the wind through the trees. One can almost think here." "Thinking," said Tommy, "is generally encouraged." Crane smiled thinly, then turned to the map that hung above the mantelpiece, a simple chart of Sutton Lee and its neighbouring fields. "If I were to drive toward the coast," he asked casually, "would that road take me to the old airstrip?" "It would," said Tommy, "though it's been out of use since the war. Why? Planning to take up flying?" "Just curious," Crane murmured, tracing a finger along the map's edge. Tuppence watched him. His touch was deliberate, too deliberate, and when he leaned back to study the map from a distance, she saw something peculiar. He was holding it upside down. "You'll get to Scotland that way," she said dryly. He turned, unflustered. "Old habit. I prefer to see things from an enemy's perspective." It was a good answer. Too good. After tea, Crane excused himself, claiming he wished to write a letter before supper. His footsteps ascended the stairs, even, precise. The moment his door clicked shut, Tuppence turned to Tommy. "Did you notice?" "Every word," he said, "including the map. The airfield question was too pointed. And the upside-down performance was no mistake. He wanted us to think he's eccentric, not dangerous. The truly dangerous sort never trip at all." Tommy paced before the hearth, thinking. If the message from London is right, and the sparrow's here, we have to assume Crane's either the bird himself or the man sent to find it. "Or both," said Tuppence. "One never excludes the double option in these matters." A faint knock interrupted them, Gladys's timid voice announcing dinner preparations. The domestic normality of it made the situation almost absurd. Espionage over shepherd's pie and custard. When Crane reappeared for the meal, his manner was perfectly civil. He complimented Mrs. Finch's cooking, discussed the village church, and even volunteered to help mend the wireless set. Yet beneath his composure was a watchfulness, his eyes moving subtly from one to the other, weighing them. Midway through dessert, he asked suddenly, "Tell me, Mrs. Beresford, do you ever have much trouble with your local constable? I imagine a quiet place like this must find its excitement where it can." "Only when the vicar's hens trespass," she said lightly. No serious crimes then." "Unless you count gossip," said Tommy. "And that's a felony punishable only by boredom." Crane laughed, but his laughter had an edge. He excused himself early, claiming correspondence to finish. When the door closed, Tuppence leaned in. "He's probing, trying to see if there's police interest nearby." "Or if we'd notice one," said Tommy. "Either way, he's uneasy." "Good. I like my suspects uneasy." The house grew quiet as night deepened. The storm's remnants muttered at the windows, and the grandfather clock in the hall kept time like an interrogator's tap. Tuppence sat at her writing desk beneath the reading lamp, turning over the coded phrase in her mind. The sparrow nests at the laurels. She pulled out her old cipher notebook, still tucked between recipe cards and address lists. After a moment's scribbling, she murmured, "Sparrow, internal leak, nests, operating base, the laurels, obvious. So yes, they mean someone here is in the network. But how did they know so quickly? Unless we were watched before he arrived." Tommy looked up from the armchair. "Meaning our little play last night, the stranded traveller, the gracious hosts, wasn't coincidence. Someone arranged it." "Exactly. He might have been sent to observe us, or he's being observed himself." "In which case," said Tommy slowly, "we might do well to ruffle his feathers a bit." "Oh, I intend to," she said, eyes gleaming. An hour later, when Crane came down for a final cup of tea before bed, Tuppence was ready. She was seated by the fire, half a letter in her hand, and a look of mild distress upon her face. "Something wrong, Mrs. Beresford?" he asked, pausing at the threshold. "Oh, just a note from my cousin in London. He says there's been terrible trouble at the ministry. Some secret papers gone missing. They think a foreign agent may have been seen in the area." She let the words hang carelessly in the air. Crane's expression didn't flicker, but his hand tightened around his cup. "How extraordinary," he said after a moment. "Still, rumours travel faster than sense in times like these." "Quite, but you never know. Our little village might yet make the news." He smiled thinly. "Let's hope not." When he left, she waited until his footsteps receded overhead. Then she turned to Tommy, who was pretending to read. "If he repeats that story to anyone," she said, "we'll know exactly what kind of sparrow we've taken in." Tommy folded his paper and smiled. "And if he doesn't? Then I'll have to invent something juicier." The clock struck 11. The house seemed to listen again as it had on the first night, the old timbers settling, the quiet alive with secrets. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Tuppence glanced toward the ceiling. "He's moving again." "Let him," said Tommy. "He can pace all he likes. He's in our nest now." The lamp flickered, throwing long shadows against the wall, two shapes still, one restless above, and the wind rose once more, whispering through the laurels outside as if repeating the warning from London. The sparrow nests at the laurels. Later that morning, bright and deceptively cheerful, as though Sutton Lee wished to deny that anything sinister could ever happen within its hedgerows, the morning light turned puddles into patches of gold, and the smell of damp grass hung in the air. Yet, beneath that calm surface, unease had taken root. Tuppence Beresford was already dressed for reconnaissance, a practical tweed skirt, stout shoes, and the expression of someone who considered curiosity an acceptable profession. Tommy, nursing his second cup of coffee, looked at her over the rim of his mug with resigned affection. "I assume," he said, "that you've thought of a reason why breaking into a deceased man's cottage before breakfast is perfectly reasonable." "I never said before breakfast," said Tuppence, fastening her brooch with a decisive click. "After breakfast. We mustn't be uncivilized. But yes, I have thought of a reason, and a rather good one." "Which is?" She turned toward him, eyes alight. "Inspector Craddock is at the coroner's office. Mrs. Calthorpe is probably recounting Denham's last smile to every available ear, which leaves his cottage unguarded. If there's anything to be found, it will be found now." Tommy sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if I married an angel or an anarchist." "Both," she said cheerfully. "Do finish your coffee." Inspector Craddock had called before dawn with grim news. Major Denham was dead. Denham's cottage stood at the far end of the lane, half hidden behind a row of lilac bushes now gone to leaf. The gate creaked mournfully as they pushed it open. Tuppence paused at the threshold, taking in the little house with its low roof and whitewashed walls. There was nothing outwardly ominous about it. It was simply too neat. The curtains were precisely drawn, the brass bell polished, the front steps freshly scrubbed. Inside, the air was faintly scented with soap and something acrid beneath, a lingering trace of smoke. "Someone's been tidying," said Tommy, glancing around, "which is not what one expects after a sudden death." "Unless someone wanted to erase something," said Tuppence. They moved cautiously through the rooms. Everything was in its place, too much so. The armchair's cushion had been plumped, the writing desk cleared of any papers, and the rug freshly shaken. Even the hearth had been swept clean, almost. Tuppence knelt near the fireplace, her fingers brushing a faint scorch mark on the flagstone. "This," she murmured, "wasn't here when the doctor called yesterday. Mason mentioned the fire had long gone out." Tommy crouched beside her. "Someone's been burning something." Using the poker, she stirred the ash. Beneath the grey powder, a curled scrap of half-burnt paper clung stubbornly to survival. She lifted it carefully with the tongs and laid it on a page torn from her notebook. Faded type and singed edges, but one word was still clear: nettle. Tommy whistled softly. "Project Nettle." "You know it?" she asked sharply. He hesitated, frowning as he reached back through years. "Yes, it was an operation during the war. I was only at the tail end of intelligence then, but I heard of it. Nettle involved forged identification documents for agents working behind German lines. It was one of the most secret undertakings we had. Only a handful of officers even knew its scope." "And Major Denham was one of them," said Tuppence quietly. "He kept the records." She glanced again at the charred scrap. "Someone tried to destroy this, but not quite thoroughly enough. That means there's more, perhaps the rest of the ledger." "Or someone already took it," Tommy said grimly. They searched the cottage with methodical patience. Drawers yielded nothing but pressed handkerchiefs, a pair of old spectacles, and envelopes containing outdated ration cards. A wooden chest in the bedroom held only neatly folded uniforms and medals, all precisely arranged. Yet beneath the bed, Tuppence's hand brushed against something solid, a small tin box, locked. Tommy raised his brows. "Shall I fetch a hairpin, or do you carry your own?" "I came prepared," she said, producing one from her pocket. "A lady must adapt." The lock yielded after a few minutes of persuasion. Inside lay only a bundle of photographs tied with twine. Soldiers in uniform, a group before a field tent, a blurred figure shaking hands with someone in civilian dress. At the very bottom was one photograph that made Tuppence pause, a younger Denham, standing beside a man whose face was partly obscured by shadow. Both were smiling, but it was the smile that caught her attention. forced, the smile of two men who knew more than they could afford to admit. "Do you know him?" she asked Tommy. He took the photograph, squinting. "Hard to say. Could be anyone, but there's something familiar, perhaps from headquarters." Tuppence replaced the photo carefully. This box was meant to mislead. Whoever searched this place didn't bother taking it because they knew where the real prize lay. Meaning? Meaning Denham hid the ledger somewhere else, and someone else already knew it. They left the cottage and made their way to the Laurels, where Inspector Craddock was waiting for their report. His hat was on the table, his raincoat steaming faintly by the fire, and his expression suggested he'd been turning thoughts over carefully and didn't like the result. "Ah," he said, rising, "I was just coming to see you. The post-mortem confirms heart failure, but the doctor notes a trace of digitalis in his bloodstream. Not enough to kill him instantly, but enough to weaken the heart." Tuppence's eyes widened. "Poison, then?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps a man medicating himself too liberally. Either way, it complicates things." "We found this," she said, handing him the charred scrap. "It was hidden under the hearth ash in Denham's cottage." Craddock examined it, his brows rising at the word nettle. "Well, that's interesting. Project Nettle. Yes, I remember now. It was one of those classified war initiatives. The code phrase from your joke fits the same network." "So Denham might have been holding something from those days," said Tommy. "Something dangerous." Craddock nodded slowly. "If that ledger survived, if it contains names, payments, or even evidence of double agents, then anyone implicated would have motive to silence him." "And to search his cottage," added Tuppence. "Perhaps that's why the place looked as though it had been spring-cleaned by an invisible hand." Craddock set the scrap down carefully. "The problem is, there's no sign of the complete ledger. I've questioned everyone who might have known Denham personally. The postmistress remembers him collecting parcels marked documents, but she thought them merely hobby papers. Mrs. Calthorpe insists she saw him carrying a black ledger in his briefcase just days before the fete." "Which he brought to the fete?" asked Tuppence. "Apparently not, but she said he was unsettled that afternoon, kept checking his watch and muttering about someone being late again." "Anthony Vale," said Tuppence softly. Craddock looked up. "The Joker?" She nodded. "He was at the fete, and he admits to overhearing the phrase 'dead man smiling' from Denham himself." Craddock's expression darkened. "Then Mr. Vale has some explaining to do." Evening settled over Sutton Lee like a shawl, soft but heavy with thought. The three of them sat before the fire, the flames throwing restless shadows across the walls. Outside, a light wind rattled the bare branches. Tuppence broke the silence first. If Denham's ledger contained sensitive records, why hide it under a joke? Craddock considered. Perhaps he feared being followed or suspected. A jest might have been his way of disguising a warning, or a message to someone who had recognized the code. Tommy leaned forward, and whoever recognized it came for him. Tuppence looked from one man to the other, her expression sharp yet thoughtful. Suppose Denham was protecting someone else, or perhaps protecting evidence that would destroy more than one reputation. In that case, his death wasn't random at all. It was delayed retribution. "Or desperation," said Craddock. "Blackmailers are rarely patient." The fire crackled, a log collapsing into a small shower of sparks. Tuppence rose, restless again, and crossed to the window. The village lay still under a pale moon. "There's a second ledger," she said at last, voice low. "The one he died protecting. That much I'm certain of." "And what makes you so sure?" Tommy asked. She turned, eyes bright in the firelight. "Because if I were hiding something that dangerous, I'd make certain to keep one copy safe. And Denham was a cautious man." Craddock gave a slow nod. "Then the question becomes, who knows where to find it?" Tuppence's voice was almost a whisper. Someone who understands how to laugh at a secret. Outside, somewhere beyond the garden, a single laugh rang faintly through the night, sharp, mocking, and gone before either of them could be sure they'd heard it at all. Morning arrived with deceptive gentleness, a sky of washed blue, the kind that makes one forget the previous night's shadows. The laurels looked almost innocent under the sunlight. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the garden shimmered from an early dew, But Tuppence, standing at the window with her coffee untouched, wasn't admiring the view. "He's gone into the village again," she said. "No letter in hand, no purpose, but gone all the same." Tommy buttoned his tweed jacket. "Then I suggest we follow suit. One never knows what secrets hide behind parish chatter. Miss Price at the post office would tell us if the Prime Minister had sneezed at breakfast." "And charge a penny stamp for the privilege," said Tuppence, smiling faintly. By 10 o'clock they were walking down the lane, the hedgerows sparkling and the air full of gossiping sparrows. Sutton Lee was one of those English villages that looked painted rather than built, whitewashed cottages, slanted roofs, and gardens defying geometry. The post office stood at the heart of it, sharing space with a sweet counter and a rack of faded postcards. Miss Price, the postmistress, was a small, brisk woman with spectacles that magnified both her eyes and her curiosity. She greeted them with an enthusiasm usually reserved for scandal. "Morning, Mrs. Beresford, Mr. Beresford. Haven't seen you down for ages. Terrible weather we've been having, though it does bring people out. You'd be surprised what news comes through my door on a rainy day." "We rather thought so," said Tuppence smoothly. "In fact, we've just had a visitor, Mr. Neville Crane. I dare say you might have noticed him." Miss Price's eyebrows leapt. "Mr. Crane, yes. Tall gentleman, nice manners, foreign sort of look about him. Oh, indeed. Passed by only the other day, asking the way to the Laurels." Tuppence froze. "The day before yesterday?" "That's right. Said he was calling on old friends, spoke quite as if he knew you well. Funny, I thought, because he asked how far it was off the main road. Not what one says if one's a regular guest." "No," said Tommy thoughtfully. "Not at all what one says." Miss Price leaned over the counter, lowering her voice, though the only other soul in the shop was a cat. "Seemed anxious, he did. Looked up the road like he was afraid someone might be following him. Of course, it's not my place to judge, but if you ask me, the gentleman's got something on his mind." "My dear Miss Price," said Tuppence warmly, "you're practically the guardian angel of village observation." Miss Price beamed. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. Still, if you see him, tell him I've not yet received that telegram he said might come. I'm to look out for it specially, you know." "We'll do that," said Tuppence lightly, though her pulse quickened. Outside, the lane shimmered with midday light, the scent of wet earth and wood smoke mingling in the breeze. Tuppence walked in silence for a moment, her mind ticking like a clock. "So," she said finally, "he was here before he ever arrived. That means his breakdown story was planned, a cover to get inside the house." "And the mention of a telegram," Tommy added. "He's expecting instructions, probably from his contact." "Then we must see who delivers it." "Agreed. But first, the vicar. If anyone knows a stranger's movements, it's the man who collects souls and gossip in equal measure." The vicarage stood at the far end of the village, a square stone house smothered in ivy and benevolence. Reverend Hesketh himself answered the door, a tall, mild-faced man with the expression of one perpetually apologizing for existing. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, what a pleasure. Do come in. Forgive the clutter. Harvest festival chaos, you know. My study's been taken over by pumpkins." "A perilous occupation for a man of the cloth," said Tommy cheerfully. The vicar led them through to a sitting room that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and polish. Books leaned against each other on every surface, forming alliances of dust. "Tea?" asked Hesketh. "No, thank you," said Tuppence. "We're only passing through. Actually, we hoped you might help us. We've a visitor at the Laurels, Mr. Neville Crane. I believe you may have seen him." The vicar's reaction was almost imperceptible, a flicker of the eyes, a tightening of the fingers on his pipe stem. "Crane?" he repeated slowly. "Why, yes, I believe he attended Evensong last month. Or was it the month before? Time does rather blur in the parish, I'm afraid." Tuppence's gaze sharpened. "He's been here before?" "Possibly," said Hesketh, avoiding her eyes. "We meet so many travellers. He may have been among them." Tommy smiled, pleasant but pointed. "He mentioned your name last night, spoke very warmly of your sermons." The vicar nearly dropped his pipe. He did? How flattering. Though I can't imagine how he stopped, recovering himself. "Well, do tell him he's welcome to call again." "We shall," said Tuppence, rising. "You're sure you've no idea what brings him here?" "None at all," said Hesketh too quickly. Outside, Tuppence exhaled. "He's lying badly." "About knowing Crane?" "About something connected to him. I don't think the Reverend's a villain, but he's frightened. You saw his hands. Trembling like the offertory plate on a windy day, Tommy agreed. We'll keep him in mind. They lunched at the King's Arms, the only inn with pretensions to grandeur, a timbered building that smelled of ale, leather, and secrets. The barmaid, a rosy-cheeked girl named Daisy, recognised them at once. "Morning, Mr. Beresford. Mrs. Beresford, haven't seen you for ages. You'll be wanting the cottage pie, I expect. Best in the county, if I do say so." "That sounds perfect," said Tuppence. "And 2 lemonades, please. We're investigating before imbibing." Daisy laughed. "Investigating what, if I may?" "A gentleman who seems to have mislaid his manners," said Tuppence. "Tall, dark, London sort. Calls himself Crane." Daisy's brow furrowed. "Crane? Can't say I've heard that name, but we had someone like that here last week. Stayed 2 nights, said he was a salesman from Bristol. Name of Mr. Carey it was." "Carey," Tommy repeated thoughtfully. "Did he by chance mention his line of goods?" "Electrical parts," he said. "Wirelesses and such. He had a case full of little bits and bobs. Looked very official. Gave me a postcard of the seaside too. Seemed charming enough, but—" "But what?" asked Tuppence. "Well, he was always glancing over his shoulder like he thought someone was following him. Paid in cash, left early, and that was that." "And he matched the man we described?" "Exactly," said Daisy, "down to the cut of his coat." Tuppence leaned back. "Then it's settled. Our guest didn't arrive by accident. He scouted the village first, checked who lived where, then staged his little breakdown." "Meaning," Tommy said quietly, "that the Laurels was his intended destination from the start." Daisy looked from one to the other, eyes wide. "You're not saying he's a criminal?" "Let's call him a collector of curiosities," said Tuppence smoothly. "We're merely one of them." Daisy laughed nervously, but her gaze followed them as they moved to a corner table. The inn was warm, the hum of conversation steady, yet Tuppence felt a chill settle in her spine. "He's moving tonight," she murmured. "Whatever his package is, he's due to deliver it. And that telegram Miss Price mentioned." The door opened. A draught swept through, carrying the scent of rain and wet leaves. The postboy entered, his cap dripping. He looked around and called, "Telegram for Mr. Neville Crane. Anyone here know him?" Tuppence rose before Tommy could move. "Yes," she said brightly. "I'll take it on his behalf. He's lodging with us at the Laurels." The boy shrugged. "All right, missus. He said it was urgent." She paid the 2pence and waited until he'd gone before unfolding the thin yellow slip. The message was typed in uneven capitals. "Tonight, midnight, deliver parcel." Her hand tightened around the paper. Tommy leaned in. "Well, that's as plain as code ever gets." "He's meeting someone, probably near the airfield," she said. "We can't let him go alone." "No," Tommy agreed. "We'll have to be ready, and quiet. Very quiet." Tuppence folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into her handbag. "He'll never know it arrived. Let's see how a spy behaves when he's waiting for orders that never come." Outside, the afternoon light was fading. The clouds had drawn together again, muting the colour of the village. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the half-hour. "You know," Tommy said as they walked toward home, "I sometimes wonder what it's like for these people, living in fear of messages and midnight meetings. It must be a lonely sort of treachery." "Lonely or not," said Tuppence, "he brought it to our doorstep, and I don't intend to let him fly away before we've clipped his wings." They turned the corner, the Laurels coming into view ahead, its windows pale in the waning light, the Laurels themselves whispering as though aware of secrets soon to be revealed. Tuppence looked at them, her resolve hardening. "Tonight," she said softly, "we find out what he's carrying, and for whom." The wind stirred again, scattering the first dry leaves of autumn across the gravel path. Somewhere behind them, the sound of the church bell faded into silence, leaving only the faint, steady beat of danger drawing near. By morning, the Laurels was no longer the quiet country refuge it had been. The gravel drive was crowded with motor cars, and the air smelled of petrol and wet wool. Men in raincoats came and went with folders under their arms, murmuring in clipped tones. The autumn mist hung low, softening their edges like ghosts from the bureaucracy. Tuppence, standing at the parlour window, watched them with a grim sort of amusement. "We've been invaded, Tommy, and not by the enemy this time, by our own." "Which is worse," he said, stirring his tea. "At least the enemy shoots straight. These fellows drown you in paper first." "Still, it's comforting to see officialdom bustle about," she replied. "It means someone else is worrying on our behalf for a change." The front door opened, and Inspector Craddock stepped in, brushing rain from his coat. He looked tired but satisfied. "Morning, Beresfords. Thought I'd better warn you. London's sending a man down. One of their top brass wants a word." "Does he have a name?" asked Tuppence. "Major Harrington, Whitehall Intelligence Division. You'll know the type: education, moustache, and the habit of never admitting to anything." "Splendid," said Tommy. "It'll be like old times." Moments later the Major arrived, a tall man in a belted trench coat, his hair silver at the temples, his expression carved from authority. His boots left perfect wet prints on the hall rug as he entered. "Mr. and Mrs. Beresford," he said crisply, removing his hat. "You've been having rather a busy week, I understand." "That depends," said Tuppence. "If you mean spies, gunfire, and sleepless nights, then yes, quite lively." A faint smile tugged at the Major's mouth. "Good. Keeps one young." He gestured to the sitting room. "May we talk privately?" The fire had been coaxed into reluctant life, and the ticking of the mantel clock filled the pauses between questions. Major Harrington opened a leather folder and glanced at his notes. "Let's be direct. 3 days ago, a courier from the Ministry of Defence disappeared from a train near Paddington. With him went a briefcase containing a classified cipher key for naval transmissions. It was believed he'd been intercepted by a double agent operating under the alias Neville Crane." "Alias?" said Tommy. "Then our guest wasn't even the real Crane." "Precisely," said the Major. "The man calling himself Crane is a known foreign operative, multiple identities, known to have infiltrated various departments under false credentials. We've traced him across Paris, Lisbon, and Madrid, but this is the first confirmed sighting in England." "And the document?" asked Tuppence. "Still missing. Our assumption is that he or his accomplice intended to move it through local channels, possibly using your village as a relay point." "Then the man found near the lane last night, he was the courier?" "Unlikely. He was what we call a mule, he kind who carries what he doesn't understand. His being found like that complicates things, but it tells us the leak runs deeper." Tuppence studied the Major. His tone was calm, almost too calm, the sort of voice that belonged to men who spent their careers tidying up after crises. "You said accomplice, Major," she said. "Do you mean the real Crane?" "Yes, the genuine Neville Crane, British, former attaché at our embassy in The Hague. Vanished 6 months ago. We believe he was turned." "So the man who stayed here, our guest, was using his name to move freely," said Tommy. "Exactly. And your house," Harrington added, "was chosen because it offered proximity to the south coast and, more importantly, credibility. No one would suspect the Beresfords of harbouring a spy." "We flatter easily," said Tuppence dryly. The Major rose, moving toward the window. Outside, a black car idled at the gate, its exhaust rising in pale clouds. "You found nothing unusual in his room?" he asked. "Not yet," said Tuppence, "but I didn't dare look closely with him still under the roof." "Then you'll permit me to assist." Together they climbed the stairs to the guest room. It was neat, too neat, as though scrubbed of all personality. The bed was made, the curtains drawn back, the suitcase gone. Only a faint smell of tobacco and metal lingered. The Major began a methodical search. Drawers, wardrobe, carpet edges. Tommy checked the bureau. Tuppence went to the bedside table, running her fingers along the inside rim of the drawer. Something caught, a thin piece of paper wedged beneath the lining. She eased it free. A photograph creased at the corners. It showed a woman, dark hair, soft eyes, the kind of beauty that seemed both intelligent and sad. Across the bottom, in looping ink, was written, "To my dearest A.C." "A.C.?" Tuppence murmured. "Does that mean anything to you, Major?" He shook his head. "Not yet, but we'll know soon enough." "Perhaps a lover?" Tommy suggested. "Or a handler," said Tuppence. "Love and espionage often share the same handwriting." The Major pocketed the photograph carefully. "Anything else?" Tommy knelt by the dressing table. "Here, something behind the mirror." He pried it loose, revealing a small folded square of cardboard. It was a train ticket. 2nd class, London to Dover, dated tomorrow. "Dover," said the Major. "The logical port for an exit. He planned to leave after one final handoff." "Or meet someone coming in," said Tuppence. "Either way," said the Major grimly. "We'll be there first." Downstairs, Craddock waited with a report. His usually cheerful face was drawn. "We've identified the dead man," he said. "Name's Cooper, local. Worked odd jobs for the vicar now and then." "The vicar," said Tuppence. "Reverend Hesketh again." "Afraid so. Looks like your hunch about him wasn't far off. We found a coded Bible margin in his study. List of initials, dates and payments. Probably used for passing messages." "You've arrested him?" asked Tommy. "Not yet. He's gone to ground." The Major sighed. "Then he's guilty, or terrified. Either way, we'll find him." Tuppence poured herself a cup of coffee and regarded the men over the rim. If Hesketh was working with Crane, perhaps he's AC, Arthur Hesketh. No, the initials don't match. Unless, she paused, unless they belong to someone else in the network. "A woman, perhaps," said Tommy. "The one in the photograph." "That would fit," said Harrington. "AC? Alice Crane, maybe? A wife or a sister?" "If she's connected," said Tuppence, "then we've only seen half the story." The morning wore on. The officials gradually thinned, leaving behind the residue of state machinery, coffee cups, cigarette ends, and a faint sense of being watched. By noon, only the three of them remained, Tommy, Tuppence, and Major Harrington, poring over a map spread on the dining table. He circled Nettle Hall, the abandoned estate on the ridge, as a likely rendezvous. "Here," said the Major, pointing to a mark along the coast, "Folkestone Road, 2 miles north of Dover. There's a safe house known to the service, abandoned since the war. If Crane intended to meet his contact, that's the most probable location." "And he's not likely to walk into a trap," said Tommy. "No," said Tuppence thoughtfully, "but he may walk into a memory." They looked at her. "He's used that alias before," she said. "Neville Crane. Why choose the same name again unless it served some purpose? Maybe the real Crane isn't dead, or he's part of it. The photograph, the initials, they could be a message. AC might be the key." The Major nodded slowly. "Possible. We'll check any woman matching the initials, especially in Dover or The Hague. But first, we locate Crane himself." "And if he reaches Dover before we do?" The Major's expression hardened. "Then he'll never leave it." By late afternoon, the rain had returned, fine as silk threads against the windows. The garden was empty now, the police gone, the laurel leaves glistening darkly. The Beresfords sat by the fire while the Major dictated a report over the telephone. "Yes, confirm presence of stolen document suspect, alias Neville Crane. Orders to intercept at Dover Terminal tomorrow morning. Prepare surveillance at both docks and station." When he hung up, he turned to them. "I'll leave 2 men here tonight in case our friend doubles back. You'll be safe." "We prefer useful to safe," said Tuppence lightly. The Major gave her a rare, approving smile. "I rather thought you might." As he left to confer with his aides, Tommy leaned close. "What are you thinking?" "That photograph bothers me," she said. "If she's important enough to keep, then she's important enough to hide. And if she's important to him, she might also be the one who sent the telegram." "You think deliver parcel came from her?" "I think it came from someone who knew what he'd understand. And a woman scorned makes an excellent spy." Tommy chuckled softly. "Remind me to stay on your good side." "Always advisable," she said. Evening fell again, closing in with the weight of uncertainty. The officials were gone, the house quiet except for the sigh of wind through the chimneys. Tuppence lingered in the hall, staring at the umbrella stand where Crane's walking stick still rested, a small, unimportant relic he had somehow left behind. She lifted it, turning it in her hands. The handle unscrewed. Inside was a hollow compartment. She drew out a thin strip of paper, tightly rolled. When she uncoiled it, she saw more of the same strange numbers and initials as the sheet Craddock had taken from the envelope. Columns, repetitions, patterns like coordinates. "Tommy!" she called. He appeared at once. "What is it now?" "The walking stick," she said. "It was hollow. He left another list." Tommy whistled, or planted it, so that someone else would come looking. Tuppence's eyes met his. Then perhaps the game isn't finished after all. They turned as the door opened behind them. Major Harrington stood there, his face grave. "We've just received a telegram from London," he said. "Another cipher fragment's turned up in Dover. Your Mr. Crane may already be on the move." Tuppence tightened her grip on the paper. "Then we'd better not keep him waiting." Outside, thunder rolled far away across the downs, and the laurels shivered as if in warning. The hunt had narrowed, and the storm was gathering again. Fog had swallowed the grounds of Nettlehall Hole, leaving only the faint glow of Craddock's lanterns cutting uncertain paths through the darkness. The rain had stopped, but mist still clung to the stones, ghostly and thick, wrapping the old estate in its own silence. Inside, the house felt alive, its corridors breathing draughts, its windows whispering. Somewhere in those long, cold passages a door slammed. Tommy spun toward the sound. "This way," he called, and the echo of his voice vanished up the staircase. Craddock's voice came from below. "Careful, Beresford, she's armed." But Tommy was already moving. His shoes slipped on the warped boards as he reached the upper landing. A faint beam of light flashed ahead, the sweep of a torch, disappearing through a half-open door at the far end of the hall. He pressed himself against the wall, heart thudding. He could hear the hurried scrape of shoes, the rustle of skirts. Then, silence. He pushed the door open. The beam of his torch caught her in mid-turn, Miss Albright. Her bandaged head gleamed pale in the dark, her face drawn, wild-eyed. One hand clutched a small pistol, the other gripped the desk for balance. "Miss Albright," Tommy said softly, his voice calm but edged, "you'll forgive the intrusion. You left your manners and your conscience there, somewhere behind you." Her lips tightened. "Where's Mrs. Beresford?" "On her way," he said, "and Craddock's not far behind. Best to put the gun down before things turn unpleasant." She gave a soft, humourless laugh. "Unpleasant? You have no idea what unpleasant is, Mr. Beresford. Denham learned. He tried to make me remember, but I never forgot." Tommy stepped closer, careful, his hands raised slightly. "Then why run?" "Because running's all that's left," she said. "You think I'm afraid of the law? No, I'm afraid of laughter, of ghosts who won't stop mocking me." There was madness in her voice, not the hysterical kind, but the brittle, exhausted madness of guilt carried too long. Before Tommy could answer, footsteps echoed in the hall. Tuppence appeared in the doorway, lantern in hand, her face pale but steady. "Miss Albright," she said quietly, "you've done enough running for one lifetime. Tell us what really happened." For a long moment, the older woman said nothing. Then, with a sudden trembling breath, she lowered the pistol to the desk and sank into the nearest chair. The misty light from the window haloed her like a weary ghost. "It began in France," she said, her voice flat but steady. 1944. Denham and I were assigned to an operation. Nettle, yes, though no one dared speak its name aloud. We were meant to smuggle false identities to informants hiding behind enemy lines. One of them was a double agent feeding both sides. We learned too late. Her eyes flickered upward, catching the lamp glow. A raid was planned. We couldn't expose him without exposing ourselves. So Denham and I did the only thing we could. We staged his death, burned the safe house, forged the report. The man vanished into smoke. "You mean," Tuppence said, "you let a traitor live?" Miss Albright nodded once. "We thought it cleaner than execution. We were fools. After the war, that man resurfaced, with friends. Blackmail, espionage, corruption, all built on what we'd buried. Denham wanted to stop him. I wanted to survive." She laughed again, low and bitter. "When he began keeping the ledger, I warned him it would destroy us both. He said the truth had to out, that no one should profit from betrayal. But when he spoke of revealing everything, I reminded him of our secret, our joke." Tuppence's eyes narrowed. "The joke from the fate." "Yes," Miss Albright's voice broke. "It wasn't a joke to us. It was our signal phrase, a reminder of the night we faked that death. When the dead man starts smiling, the ledger goes missing." He understood what it meant. When I repeated it to him weeks ago, I only meant to warn him to stay silent. But that fool Vale, she spat the name, he took it for comedy. He said it aloud to half the village, and suddenly everyone was laughing. Everyone but me. She pressed a shaking hand to her temple. "So yes, I went to Denham's that night. We argued. He said he'd burned half the ledger, hidden the rest. I begged him to stop. He laughed, said the war had never ended, only changed its uniforms. That laughter, I hear it still." Tuppence's voice was soft, but it carried. "You shot him?" Miss Albright looked up sharply. "No, he died of his own heart. I only frightened him. When he fell, I thought, perhaps justice had chosen for me. I left before dawn, but I didn't kill him." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. And the Joker cards? Miss Albright frowned, confused. What? The cards left at the scenes, Tuppence said. At your bedside, in Vale's room, even in Denham's ashes. The Joker, mocking, smiling. I know nothing of them, said Albright quickly. I swear it. Her reaction was genuine. Fear, not guilt. Tommy could see it. Her eyes were darting, uncertain, but not deceptive. Tuppence stepped closer, the lantern's light flickering over the old nurse's face. Then you didn't send the telegram from Geneva either, the one warning Denham to leave before it was too late? No, her voice cracked. I haven't left England in years. Then there's someone else, said Tommy. Someone who knew the phrase, the ledger, the signal, and who wants to finish what you started. Miss Albright buried her face in her hands. You don't understand. There can't be anyone else. Only Denham and I knew that phrase. The others died long ago. Not all, said Tuppence quietly. The man whose death you staged, he didn't die, remember? He's still out there, watching, laughing. The room went very still. Miss Albright raised her head slowly, her face ashen. No, she whispered. Impossible. We destroyed his file. Tommy nodded toward the ledger on the desk. Perhaps not completely. Footsteps again, heavier this time, running along the corridor. Craddock burst through the door, revolver drawn. She's not alone, he said breathlessly. Someone's in the west wing. Saw a shadow on the stairs. Vale? Asked Tuppence. Craddock shook his head. Too tall. Moved like a soldier. Miss Albright made a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. You see? It's him. He's come back. Tuppence turned to the inspector. Seal the exits. Whoever's here won't get far. Craddock nodded and vanished down the hall. Tommy crossed to the window. The mist outside swirled like smoke, swallowing the lawn and trees. Somewhere beyond, a faint crunch of gravel echoed, the sound of footsteps moving swiftly toward the side gate. He turned. They're running. Tuppence grabbed her coat. Then so are we. They followed the sound through the narrow passageways, the beams of their torches slicing through the foggy gloom. The air smelled of damp wood and old secrets. From somewhere ahead came the slam of an outside door. They burst through into the courtyard. The moon had reappeared, a dull coin behind the clouds. At the far end of the gravel path, a figure moved. A man, cloaked and quick, heading toward the trees. Stop! Craddock's voice rang out from the other side of the courtyard. The figure turned just for a heartbeat and the light caught his face. Tuppence froze. Good heavens, the vicar! Reverend Hesketh hesitated, then bolted into the mist. Tommy and Craddock gave chase, their footsteps pounding over the wet ground. The fog closed around them, thick and white. They caught sight of him again, struggling with the latch on a rusted gate that led toward the river. "Hold it right there, Reverend!" shouted Craddock. The vicar turned, and for a moment his calm, saintly mask cracked. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I did it for them, for all of us." Then, with sudden fury, he raised something, a small revolver. The barrel gleamed dully. Craddock fired first. The report echoed across the empty fields. The vicar staggered, dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. Craddock ran forward, kicking the gun aside. "Get a light over here!" Tuppence's lantern beam found the man's face. He was breathing, but faintly. His eyes were glassy, full of pain, and something like relief. "I thought it was over," he murmured. "Denham was going to expose us all. The ledger, it wasn't just blackmail. It was judgment." Tuppence knelt beside him. "You were the one sending the cards?" He gave a weak smile. "Yes. The Joker, the fool. I thought, if I could frighten them, perhaps they'd stay silent. But Albright, Vale, they panicked. Too many ghosts." His voice faltered. He should never have laughed. It was his laughter that started it all. "Whose?" asked Tuppence. "Denham's." "No," whispered the vicar. "The dead man we buried alive." His eyes closed. The fog swallowed his last breath. They stood there a long moment, the mist curling around them, the silence broken only by the wind in the trees. Craddock holstered his weapon, his face grim. "We'll need to confirm everything, but if what he said's true, Denham, Albright, Vale, and the vicar, they all shared the same crime." "Faking a death," said Tommy, "and paying for it ever since." Tuppence's gaze drifted toward the river, its surface pale and shifting. "And the laughter," she murmured. It wasn't joy. It was guilt echoing through the years. Craddock turned to her. "We'll take them all in for statements. I'll have men secure this place till morning." Tuppence nodded absently. Her eyes were still on the trees beyond, where the fog had begun to lift. The moonlight caught the old stone of Nettle Hall, making it gleam wetly, like something newly unearthed. Tommy touched her arm. "You're shivering." She smiled faintly. "Not from cold, dear. Just the realization that the dead don't always stay buried, not when the living keep telling their jokes." Later, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Craddock's car waited at the gate. Miss Albright sat inside, silent, hands folded in her lap. Vale stood apart, his expression dazed. Tuppence paused before climbing in, glancing back one last time. Through the thinning fog, the windows of Nettle Hall looked almost bright, like the hollow eyes of something that had finally finished watching. Tommy joined her. "What are you thinking?" "That there's one detail still wrong," she said softly. "If Albright didn't know about the Joker cards, and the vicar admits to sending them, who left the very first one?" Tommy frowned. "You mean?" She shook her head. "Perhaps that's a mystery for another morning. For now, let's call it what it is." "A joke repeated?" She smiled faintly. "Exactly. And as Denham once said, the joke's only funny until someone stops laughing." The rain had returned to Sutton Lee, not the wild, furious kind that beats against windows in anger, but the steady, mournful kind that seems to wash a story clean. It fell in thin silver lines down the panes of the laurels, blurring the world outside into soft shadows. Inside, the sitting room glowed with lamplight, but the mood was anything but bright. Inspector Craddock stood by the hearth, his hat and coat dark with damp, his expression graver than usual. On the sofa sat Miss Albright, hands clasped, her face grey with fatigue. 2 constables waited in the hall. "She's confessed to her part in Denham's death," Craddock said quietly to Tommy and Tuppence. "She admits she went to see him that night, that they argued, but insists she left him alive. Given the heart condition, it's plausible. The Crown will decide how kindly to view her conscience." Tuppence, seated at the writing desk, turned a pencil between her fingers. "And the vicar?" "Dead before morning," said Craddock, his voice low. "Shock and loss of blood. I'd say justice caught up with him faster than we did." Silence lingered a moment, not comfortable but final. Then Tommy poured coffee, strong and dark, and said softly, "So that's it then, the joke's over." Tuppence didn't answer. She was staring at the fire, her brow furrowed. Something in her expression told him the case, to her mind, was far from finished. Craddock noticed too. "You're not satisfied, Mrs. Beresford?" She looked up. "I'm satisfied Miss Albright is guilty, but not alone. There's one piece that doesn't fit." Craddock sighed. "After the week we've had, I could fill a cathedral with things that don't fit. Which piece precisely?" Tuppence rose, restless, pacing before the mantel. "Mrs. Calthorpe's joke." Tommy blinked. "The one she told at tea? I thought that was how all this nonsense started." "Exactly," said Tuppence, "only it didn't start there. She repeated it, but slightly wrong. I remember every word she said that afternoon. There once was a dead man who smiled when they found the ledger missing. But according to Vale, Denham's original phrase was, 'When the dead man starts smiling, they'll know the ledger's gone.'" Tommy frowned. "And the difference means—" "It means Mrs. Calthorpe didn't just overhear the joke," said Tuppence slowly. "She remembered it from years ago." Craddock straightened, interest lighting his eyes. "Go on." "Everyone else heard it at the fete, but she changed one word, the kind of change someone makes when they know the original line too well. Start smiling became smiled when, past tense, as though she'd heard it long before. Tommy set his cup down with a soft clink. "You think she knew Denham?" "I think she knew him intimately," said Tuppence, "and more than that, I think she hated him." They found Mrs. Calthorpe that afternoon exactly where she was most at home, in her parlour, surrounded by cushions, teacups, and the faint aroma of lavender. The wireless murmured a waltz, and her plump hands fluttered with their usual animation as she greeted her visitors. "My dear Mrs. Beresford. Inspector, you look dreadfully serious. Surely you're not here about that horrid business again. I've told you everything I know." Tuppence smiled, all charm and composure. "I know, Mrs. Calthorpe, but I fear we've come for one final clarification. It's about that joke you told at our tea." The older woman brightened. "Oh, that silly thing. Well, I do love to bring a little laughter into life, especially these days. What about it?" "It's such a peculiar phrase," said Tuppence, her tone deceptively light. "Almost like an inside joke. The dead man who smiled when they found the ledger missing. How did it go again?" Mrs. Calthorpe repeated it, delighted to be performing. "Yes, that's right. Oh, it caused quite the stir, didn't it?" Craddock's voice was mild. "And where did you hear it, madam?" The woman waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, goodness, I can't recall. One of those little tales that go around at fêtes. You know how people chatter." Tuppence tilted her head. "Then you didn't hear it from Major Denham himself?" Mrs. Calthorpe's smile faltered for the briefest instant. "Major Denham? No, I hardly knew the man, only to nod to in passing." "Curious," said Tuppence softly, "because the phrase was his invention. He used it during the war, a private code apparently. Few would have known it unless they served with him." Mrs. Calthorpe's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Tommy stepped in, his tone almost conversational. "And yet you quoted it perfectly, except for one word. Past tense, wasn't it? You said he smiled, not start smiling, almost as if you were remembering something he once said to you." The colour drained from Mrs. Calthorpe's cheeks. The cup rattled faintly on its saucer. Well, perhaps I misremembered," she stammered. "We old women often do." Tuppence's voice, when it came, was soft as silk and sharp as a scalpel. "But not when it comes to jokes, Mrs. Calthorpe. You pride yourself on remembering every punchline, and this one wasn't told for amusement. It was told to hurt." Craddock moved closer, his gaze steady. "Why don't you tell us the truth, madam, before we find it ourselves?" The smile that had been her armour for decades began to tremble. For a moment, she seemed about to protest again, then something inside her gave way. She set her cup down with deliberate care, folded her hands, and looked up at them all. "Well," she said at last, "it appears I've been found out." The transformation was startling. The flutter vanished. The voice, once light and syrupy, dropped into something cooler, clearer, a woman stripped of pretense. "My name, before I married, was Lillian Carter. My husband, Captain Richard Carter, served under Major Denham during the war. He trusted Denham, admired him, and Denham repaid that trust by destroying him." Tuppence's eyes widened. "Captain Carter, the informant they faked as dead?" "Precisely," said Mrs. Calthorpe with a bitter laugh. "They called it mercy. I call it betrayal. Denham let the world believe my husband was a traitor. He was no such thing, only guilty of knowing too much. When the war ended, Denham and his cronies burned his name and built their careers on the ashes. I made it my business to see they paid for it." Craddock's voice was grim. "So you came here, settled near Sutton Lee." "An old widow, harmless and chatty," she said. "People tell widows everything. It wasn't difficult to find out where Denham lived, or that Miss Albright still hovered like a guilty ghost. I only had to wait. And when that silly fate provided the perfect excuse, I repeated the old joke, to stir the past awake." Tuppence's voice was low. "You made Miss Albright think the past was hunting her." "She deserved it," snapped Mrs. Calthorpe. "They all did. I wanted them frightened. Each of them reminded of what they'd done. The joker cards, the letters, the little phrases, they were nothing more than my way of watching them squirm." Tommy gave a slow whistle. "And when Denham died?" The woman's smile returned, brittle, dangerous. "I didn't kill him. I only reminded him that ghosts laugh too. I thought the heart would do the rest. And it did." Craddock shook his head. "You took justice into your own hands." "Justice?" she said softly. "No, Inspector. Vengeance. There's a difference, though not one that matters to me anymore." Her eyes glinted suddenly. "But you'll never find the full ledger. Denham hid it from you all, and you'll keep chasing shadows till kingdom come." Tuppence's expression didn't change. "Perhaps, but I've learned to look in unexpected places." That evening, the Laurels was quiet again. Miss Albright had been taken away, the constables gone, and Craddock sat weary but satisfied by the fire. Tuppence, however, was restless. She moved from desk to shelf, her mind ticking through the puzzle. Tommy watched her with amusement. "I recognize that look. It's the same one you had when we misplaced the sherry labels in 37. "Tommy," she said absently, "what do you do when something's meant to be hidden in plain sight?" "Ignore it," he said promptly. "Exactly." She crossed to the bookshelf, the one in their parlour that held Denham's papers, Vale's statements, and a few stray volumes Mrs. Calthorpe had once lent her. She ran her fingers along the spines until they stopped on one, a garish red cover titled A Treasury of British Wit and Jokes. "Tommy," she murmured, "how many widows do you know who collect joke books?" He blinked. "Only one, thank heaven." Tuppence pulled the volume free. It felt heavy, too heavy. When she opened it, the pages resisted, thick at the centre. She slipped a fingernail into the seam and pried gently. The spine split, revealing a cavity cut neatly into the book's heart. Inside lay a small black notebook, worn and soot-stained. "The ledger," she breathed. Craddock took it carefully, flipping through its pages. Names, codes, payments, the full account. "Denham's original," he said, "and Mrs. Calthorpe's trophy." Tuppence smiled faintly. The smile behind the smile. She wasn't mocking fate, only keeping score. The next morning dawned clear. The rain had finally washed the village clean, and the church bell tolled over Sutton Lee, solemn but calm. Mrs. Calthorpe was taken away quietly, wrapped in her shawl, her hat set neatly on her curls. As the car pulled from the drive, she turned her head toward the laurels and gave Tuppence one last look, not defiant, but wistful. "I only wanted the world to remember," she said softly through the open window. "Even laughter dies if no one listens." Tuppence's voice was gentle. "And sometimes, Mrs. Calthorpe, it's better if it does." The window rolled up. The car disappeared down the lane. Tommy slipped an arm around his wife's shoulders. "Well, darling, that's another case closed, and another village that won't look us in the eye for a month," she smiled. "They'll get over it. English villages always do. The tea revives them." Craddock, standing nearby, looked at them both with grudging admiration. "You know, Mrs. Beresford, if you ever tire of village life, Scotland Yard could use a mind like yours." Tuppence's eyes sparkled. "Thank you, Inspector, but I prefer my mysteries with better china." He laughed, shook their hands, and departed. As the Beresfords stood in their doorway watching the morning mist lift, the world felt lighter, though not entirely free of shadow. "Tommy," said Tuppence thoughtfully, "do you think laughter can be dangerous?" "Undoubtedly," he said. "I've sat through your cousin George's after-dinner speeches." She nudged him. "I mean the kind that hides pain. Mrs. Calthorpe smiled for 20 years, and it nearly killed half the village," he considered. "Then perhaps the trick is knowing when the joke's over." Tuppence slipped her arm through his. "Quite, and I think, for once, it truly is." They walked back inside as the sunlight finally broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the threshold. On the mantel, the old red joke book sat quietly among the other volumes, its hollow spine now empty, its laughter finally spent. Outside, the rain stopped altogether, and the air carried only the faintest echo of a chuckle, the last sigh of a story that had, at long last, forgotten to laugh. It was one of those rare English afternoons when peace seemed possible, or at least plausible. Sutton Lee basked under a thin, forgiving sunlight, the kind that softened edges and made even the village's cracked pavements look poetic. The storm, literal and otherwise, had passed. Nettle Hall stood empty again, the gates chained, the ivy reclaiming its walls as if to smother what had been whispered there. The police had gone, the newspapers had taken their photographs, and life, in its stubborn way, was trying to return to normal. At the Laurels, Tommy Beresford sat in his favourite armchair, a newspaper folded across one knee and a plate of buttered scones dangerously close to his elbow. He looked, as Tuppence had once told him, the very image of domestic triumph, which, in your case, is always suspicious. "Listen to this," he said, tapping the paper. "Village widow charged in wartime scandal." They make it sound almost glamorous. You'd think Mrs. Calthorpe was Matahari in a tea cosy. Tuppence, across from him at the writing desk, didn't look up from her letters. "She'd like that comparison," she said softly. "It means people will remember her. That's all she wanted." Tommy rustled the paper thoughtfully. I suppose she'll get her wish. Bit of a pity, though. I'd grown rather fond of her gossip. Tuppence smiled faintly. That's because you never had to correct it. He lowered the paper, watching her. The sunlight fell across her hair, turning it to honey gold. For the first time in days, she looked relaxed, though there was still something thoughtful behind her eyes, that familiar spark of curiosity she never quite extinguished. Still thinking about it? He asked. She nodded, setting down her pen. Yes, about how it began, all because of a joke. Something so small, so ordinary. It makes one wonder how many tragedies start the same way, with laughter that isn't really laughter at all. Tommy leaned back, the chair creaking. You do make humour sound positively lethal. Tuppence's eyes glinted. Perhaps it is. Jokes reveal things we don't mean to share. They're confessions with good timing. Then heaven help the comedians, he said dryly. They'll have to start carrying warrants. She chuckled, rising to pour more tea. You may laugh, Tommy, but every jest has a truth somewhere inside it. Denham's, Albright's, even Mrs. Calthorpe's. The joke was their secret, their guilt dressed up for company. He accepted the cup she handed him and said, And where does that leave us, partner of mine? Hopefully guiltless, she replied, though I suspect you've hidden a few crimes of your own under your so-called humour. Only verbal ones, he said, usually committed before breakfast. Her laugh was soft but warm, filling the room like sunlight spilling through lace curtains. Outside, the garden stirred in a late afternoon breeze. The air was rich with damp earth and the faint sweetness of hyacinth. Albert could be heard humming somewhere in the kitchen, something tuneless but cheerful, a sound that promised normality had resumed. Tuppence moved to the window, gazing out. Across the lane, Mrs. Peveril was hanging out her washing. A little further down, the vicarage curtains fluttered where a new tenant had moved in. Life, with its curious lack of drama, had reclaimed Sutton Lee. She turned back to Tommy. You know, there's something rather comforting about all this. The tea, the quiet, the faint smell of burnt toast. He grinned. That last one's Albert's contribution to the atmosphere. Very avant-garde. Still, she said, settling beside him, I can't help feeling the village will never be quite the same. Once a place has hosted murder, something lingers. Not ghosts exactly, but echoes. Tommy took her hand. If you start hearing laughter in the night, I shall move us to Bournemouth at once. Don't worry, she said, smiling. If I do, it'll only be your snoring. A gentle knock interrupted them. Albert appeared in the doorway, looking faintly apologetic. Inspector Craddock to see you, ma'am. Says it's nothing official, just social-like. Show him in, Albert, said Tuppence. Craddock entered a moment later, looking surprisingly relaxed out of uniform, though his overcoat was as immaculate as ever. He nodded to Tommy, smiled faintly at Tuppence, and said, I promise I'm not bringing trouble. Just a call of courtesy, and if you've any left, a cup of tea. Always, said Tuppence, pouring another. You've earned it. He accepted it with thanks and sank into the nearest chair. It's quiet again, he said, almost unnaturally so. After a week like that, the peace feels guilty. Tommy chuckled. That's the English way. We apologise for everything, even silence. Craddock sipped his tea. Well, the Yard's satisfied. The papers have their scandal, and the Home Office will make something confidential sound heroic. Justice of a kind has been done. Though between us, he added with a wry glance, it was done mostly in your sitting room. Tuppence inclined her head. It's a versatile sitting room. Craddock leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You know, Mrs. Beresford, I've been trying to put my finger on how you do it. You don't interrogate people, you listen. To the tone, the choice of words, even the silences. You solved this case because you heard what no one else did, a joke told wrong. She smiled gently. Sometimes that's all truth is, Inspector. Something told slightly wrong. He nodded. Then allow me to tell the truth correctly. Only you two could solve a murder by listening to a joke. Tommy raised his cup. We'll add it to the business card. Beresford Investigations, solving crimes with wit and charm. Craddock laughed. I'd hire you myself if I weren't afraid you'd solve my pension next. They talked a while longer, of trivial things mostly, the weather, the roses, the cricket match postponed by rain. But underneath the conversation ran that subtle current of shared understanding, the bond of people who had looked into darkness and chosen, stubbornly, to remain good-humoured. When Craddock finally rose to leave, dusk was settling outside, the sky painted in violet and gold. He paused at the door. "You know," he said, "the thing about laughter is, it's the last sound left when people stop pretending." Tuppence smiled. Then perhaps Mrs. Calthorpe's laughter was a confession all along. "Or a farewell," said Craddock. "Either way, she'll never laugh again." He tipped his hat, nodded to Tommy, and stepped into the evening. The Beresfords stood a moment in the quiet that followed. The last of the sunlight had faded, and the fire flickered low. Tommy moved to draw the curtains. "You know, Tuppence," he said over his shoulder, "next time we're invited to a village fete, I vote we stay home. Fewer corpses, more scones." "Agreed," she said, joining him by the hearth. "Though I can't promise to resist curiosity if someone tells a good joke." He groaned theatrically. "Remind me never to laugh again." "Impossible," she said. "It's what keeps us human." The fire gave a last, contented pop. The house settled into its evening rhythm, the tick of the mantel clock, the faint rattle of china from the kitchen, and the sigh of wind along the eaves. Tommy refolded his newspaper. "So, my dear Mrs. Beresford, what moral shall we draw from this particular adventure?" Tuppence considered. "Perhaps that laughter, like truth, is dangerous when used carelessly." He smiled. "Then I'll be careful to aim mine only at safe targets, such as myself." "Good," she said, pouring them both one last cup of tea. "Because in the end, Tommy, the world's full of mysteries. Some we solve, some we leave alone. But if we can still laugh at the right ones, perhaps we're doing all right." He raised his cup. "To laughter, then, the harmless kind." "To laughter," she echoed. Their cups met with a soft clink. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echo, not eerie this time, but warm, human, and alive. It mingled with the creak of the old gate and the distant toll of the church bell, the sounds of a village returning to peace. And in the laurels, with firelight painting the walls and tea perfuming the air, the Beresfords' laughter rose, quiet, content, and utterly genuine. The laughter of two people who had seen too much to be fooled, but not enough to lose heart.